The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying fine sheets of snow across the frozen ground. Ethan Miller tightened his coat against the biting cold as he stepped onto his porch, the wood creaking beneath his boots. Winter in this part of Alaska wasn't just harsh, it was relentless. The kind of cold that settled in your bones and never quite left. It was early morning, and the land was silent except for the occasional groan of shifting ice. But then, beneath the wind's constant roar, a sound reached him, faint, desperate. A low, guttural cry. Ethan paused, his breath clouding in the air. The noise came again, distant but unmistakable. Something was out there. Frowning, he grabbed his gloves and set off through the snow, following the sound toward the tree line. The path wasn't easy, each step crunched through knee-deep drifts, his breath coming in short bursts. And then, just beyond the ridge, he saw it. A lynx. Its powerful body was half buried in the snow, hind legs splayed awkwardly, and its front paws twisted in a frantic attempt to free itself. Thick rope cut into its limbs, binding it to the wooden fence that marked the edge of his property. Ethan's gut clenched. This wasn't a hunting snare. Someone had tied this lynx here deliberately. Ethan's fingers trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket, his breath hitching in the cold. He dialed the authorities, his voice low but urgent. "I've got a lynx tied up on my property," he said. "Somebody did this on purpose." The dispatcher didn't hesitate. "Stay back and wait for an officer. Help is on the way." Ethan hung up, his gaze never leaving the lynx. Its breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of its chest labored. Snow clung to its matted fur, ice forming along its whiskers. It should have been fighting, snapping, something, but it just lay there, watching him. 15 minutes later, the crunch of tires broke the eerie silence. A dark SUV pulled up, and a woman stepped out, her boots sinking into the deep snow. Officer Sarah Donovan. Ethan recognized her. She handled wildlife cases around these parts. She took one look at the lynx and exhaled sharply. "This isn't a trap," she murmured. This was deliberate. Moving carefully, she pulled a pair of thick gloves from her belt and knelt beside the animal. The lynx flinched but didn't growl. Up close, its condition was even worse. Its ribs showed through its fur, and the ropes had rubbed its skin raw. "This thing hasn't eaten in days," she said, pulling out a knife. "Stay back. If it panics, we don't want it turning on us." Ethan nodded but kept his eyes on the animal. The knife's edge gleamed in the pale light as Donovan worked the blade through the thick rope. The lynx twitched, muscles tensing, but it didn't try to escape. The final rope snapped, falling away into the snow. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, instead of bolting into the forest, the lynx slowly lifted its head, its amber eyes locking onto Ethan's. It didn't move. Didn't flee. Just sat there, shivering. "What the hell?" Ethan whispered. Donovan shook her head. "That's not normal." Then Ethan noticed something, just beyond the lynx, in the untouched snow near the fence. Deep, heavy boot prints leading away from the scene. His stomach twisted. Someone had stood here, watching. Someone had done this on purpose. He turned to Donovan. This wasn't random. She followed his gaze, her expression darkening. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." The lynx let out a faint, rasping sound, a sound that sent a shiver through Ethan's spine. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over yet. The lynx hesitated, its muscles trembling with exhaustion. Then, instead of disappearing into the forest, it limped toward Ethan's porch. Snow clung to its fur as it collapsed onto the wooden steps, its breath shallow, its body curled as if waiting. Ethan exchanged a glance with Officer Donovan. "That's not normal," she murmured. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt, extending her hand just a few inches toward the lynx. It flinched but didn't lash out. Then, to their shock, the lynx dragged itself forward and pressed its head against Ethan's boot. A silent plea. Ethan swallowed hard. He'd spent his life around animals, but this was different. This wasn't instinct or desperation. This was trust. And that's when he saw it. A faint ridge of scar tissue along the lynx's hind leg, barely visible beneath the thick fur. It wasn't new. It had healed over time. This thing's been trapped before, Ethan muttered, crouching lower. Not just now, before. Donovan's jaw tightened. You think someone had it? That it escaped? Ethan's gut churned. No. I think, he exhaled, the thought chilling him more than the wind. I think it was taken back. Ethan and Officer Donovan followed the lynx's faint tracks, their breath fogging in the freezing air. The trail led them deep into the woods, where the trees grew dense, their skeletal branches swaying against the wind. Then they saw it. An abandoned shed, half buried in snow, its wooden walls warped with age. The door hung ajar, swinging with a slow, eerie creak. Ethan's gut twisted. This place looks like it hasn't been touched in years. Donovan stepped inside first, her flashlight sweeping across the dark, musty interior. And then, her beam landed on something that made her stomach drop. Collars. Chains. Rusted cages stacked in the corner. Scraps of fur clung to the metal bars, and among the discarded gear, Ethan spotted nylon rope, the same kind that had been used on the lynx. This wasn't just a one-time thing, Donovan said grimly, pulling out a radio. Someone's been trapping animals here. Ethan ran a hand over the nearest cage, his jaw clenched. And not just trapping. Keeping them. A beat of silence. Then Donovan exhaled sharply. I remember a case from last year, wild lynxes stolen from a refuge up north. They were never found. She turned to Ethan. What if this one escaped? Ethan looked toward the tree-line, where the lynx had disappeared. It had been taken before. And now, given the chance, would it be able to survive on its own again? 2 weeks later, wildlife officials deemed the lynx fit for release. The injuries had healed, and despite its time in captivity, the animal had retained its instinct to survive. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, watching as the transport cage door slowly creaked open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the lynx stepped out. Its paws sank into the snow, ears flicking at the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. It was free, but it didn't run. Instead, it turned. Golden eyes met Ethan's. A quiet moment passed between them, something unspoken lingering in the air. Ethan wasn't sure if he imagined it, but in that brief instant, it felt like a message. I remember you. Thank you. Then, with a final flick of its tail, the lynx disappeared into the white wilderness. Ethan exhaled, his breath curling in the cold. He watched the last traces of the lynx's footprints before they faded beneath fresh snowfall. Some animals just know who to trust, he murmured. Donovan glanced over at him. Think we'll ever see it again? Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe. But some things belong to the wild. And even if they leave, they never really forget. As they turned back toward the truck, the forest stood silent and vast, a place of both mystery and survival. Somewhere out there, the lynx ran free once more.